In the post-colonial era led by the U.S., a country's domestic order is often influenced by its position in the international order. On February 6, 2024, the South Korean government under Yoon Suk-yeol announced they would increase medical school admissions by 2,000 each year to address the tight healthcare resources. 2 weeks later, doctors across South Korea started striking, with nearly 12,000 doctors leaving their posts and taking to the streets. In response to this situation, Yoon Suk-yeol initially took a very tough stance. However, as professors from 40 medical universities in South Korea started handing in their resignation letters, the stance of the Ministry of Health began to soften. This issue, which has stumped 3 consecutive South Korean governments, will likely have to rely on the wisdom of future generations. Around the same time, about 30 kilometers south of Seoul, another protest was taking place in Suwon City. Dozens of civic organizations were against a sex expo scheduled for April, protesting the local government and businesses openly treating women's bodies as commodities and objectifying them. However, the impact of this protest was much less significant. In the end, it all ended in failure. Since the establishment of South Korea, the sex industry has really thrived and even became a significant source of foreign exchange. With all the huge business interests at stake, this little protest didn't stand a chance. On one side, you have the powerful medical industry alliance, and on the other, just a bunch of scattered grassroots organizations. From a broader perspective on social interests, the protest that was supposed to be a success actually flopped, while the one that was expected to fail ended up succeeding. These two seemingly unrelated social phenomena really highlight the abnormal social ecology and power structure in South Korea. This tragic situation traces back to the encounter between South Korea's first president, Rhea Seon-jiman, and General MacArthur 76 years ago. In 1948, MacArthur became the first high-ranking U.S. official to step foot in South Korea, laying the groundwork for U.S.-South Korea relations. 5 years later, with the signing of the U.S.-South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty, 18 U.S. military bases began to pop up across South Korea. The soldiers brought not just promises from the White House but also a ton of cash. For many women in South Korea, struggling to make ends meet at the time, providing services to the U.S. military was a quick way to earn money. As night fell, the streets of Itaewon, just a 10-minute drive from the U.S. Army's Yongsan base, would come alive with activity. There are countless bars, dance halls, and casinos for American soldiers to enjoy, but what they really love are those hidden spots deep in the bars where they can have some fun. For the price of just a cigarette, they can satisfy their youthful desires. By 1958, this country had a total population of 22 million. There are 350,000 sex workers, with 60% living around U.S. military bases. Back then, South Korea was really short on foreign currency, so the government kind of ignored the chaos around those bases. But as the political scene in South Korea changed dramatically, these sex workers started to become pawns in the political games of the Blue House. In May 1961, Park Chung-hee staged a coup and set up a military government. At first, the U.S. didn't really recognize his government. The commander of U.S. troops in Korea, General Magruder, even said that the U.S. military would suppress the forces behind Park's coup. To gain legitimacy, Park quickly promised the U.S. that he would send troops to Vietnam to help fight against North Vietnam. At the same time, he established a special zone near U.S. military bases to give Americans special privileges. The U.S. military can arrest or even detain South Korean citizens in the special zone according to their rules. The South Korean government has shifted from being secretive to openly supporting the sex industry in that area. Officials involved in crackdowns started seizing land around the bases, demolishing local homes to create bustling commercial streets. To get more women involved, South Korean newspapers back then referred to those working as sex workers at the U.S. military bases. Officials from the national government even set up basic English and etiquette classes for South Korean women who came forward to enlist, constantly encouraging them to promote their services more enthusiastically in front of the soldiers. This officially became a key part of South Korea's post-war economy, reaching 5% of the country's GDP in the 1970s. As former sex worker Kim A-yeran put it, the South Korean government was the biggest pimp for the U.S. military. However, their nightmare was just beginning. In 1971, a survey targeting U.S. troops in Korea shocked Congress. 85% of U.S. soldiers stationed in South Korea reported having contact with new workers, and on average, 568 out of every 1,000 troops have contracted a sexually transmitted infection. To please Congress and maintain South Korea's image, Park Chung-hee initiated a cleanup campaign around the bases. After that, Korean women providing sexual services near the bases were required to undergo testing twice a week. Women who tested positive for STIs were forcibly detained for treatment, which basically meant being made to take excessive amounts of penicillin to ensure they could continue providing clean services for the U.S. military. If someone unfortunately dies from a severe reaction to the medicine, there's actually a special graveyard nearby just for them. Because they got injected with way too much antibiotics, these new workers end up with weak, drooping shoulders and walk around like monkeys, not really looking human. So, the places where these new workers get treated are also looked down upon by the locals. It's called monkey woe because from the economy to national security, South Korea is highly dependent on the US, so Tsinghua has to really please America. The US troops in Korea, as representatives of the US, have become a group of privileged individuals who operate above national sovereignty. What we call social order is just people's way of managing expectations about what's reasonable and what's not. The post-colonial order that the US brought has set an example for South Korean society. Various interest groups have formed a privileged class that's gradually become seen as an acceptable norm, showing up in all aspects of ordinary people's daily lives. People both hate them and yet have to live with them. In South Korea, doctors aren't just well-paid and have stable jobs with high social status, the industry's monopolization has made them a privileged class in society. In June 2007, a 40-year-old hospital director in Tongyeong, South Gyeongsang Province, was exposed for taking advantage of several female patients while they were under full anesthesia. A middle school girl from Gwangju, Jeollanam-do, who had run away from home, was held captive for 6 months and forced to have relations with over 1,000 men, including many professors, doctors, and pharmacists. These incidents have sparked outrage among the South Korean public towards the medical community. However, the doctors involved didn't face the punishment they deserved. In the case of the imprisoned female student, the police didn't even detain the doctors and pharmacists involved, and they said they wouldn't release their names even after the investigation was done. In the case of the anesthetic assault, the doctor was sentenced to prison, but after getting out, he just opened another clinic locally. There are plenty of similar cases based on data from 2014 to 2019. The crime rate among doctors in South Korea has been steadily rising, with 611 doctors arrested for sexual violence over the past 5 years, but only 4 have been suspended. There's also a widespread issue of over-medicalization, which has significantly increased the financial burden on regular patients. Since 1977, the country's GDP has grown 116 times, while healthcare costs have skyrocketed by 511 times. It seems like the Yoon Suk-yeol government is trying to tackle its low approval ratings by targeting the healthcare sector, which has strong public support, but the medical community in South Korea is notoriously tough to deal with. Including Moon Jae-in, multiple South Korean governments have failed to successfully implement reforms because 90% of the country's medical resources are controlled by private hospitals. The medical associations, represented by the Doctors Association, can effectively mobilize the entire healthcare system to push back against government reforms. The last successful major healthcare reform in South Korea was quite a while ago. Back in 2000, the South Korean government put a lot on the table to push through reforms. After the 1997 financial crisis hit Asia, the won lost 47% of its value against the dollar in just 2 months, and the country was running out of foreign reserves, facing bankruptcy. So, the Korean government struck a deal with the IMF for a $58.4 billion loan, but they had to agree to reform their financial sector and open up their key assets. As part of the agreement, multinational pharmaceutical companies from the US started making their move into the South Korean medical field. At that time, local pharmaceutical companies had already built a strong alliance with doctors over several decades. These local companies offered doctors high commissions to prescribe their own brand of medications. In March 1999, a group of multinational pharmaceutical companies led by the US established the Korean Research-Based Pharmaceutical Industry Association, which quickly grew into a powerful lobbying group pushing the South Korean government to open up the local medical market. Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund was also heavily intervening. South Korea's national health insurance is facing a serious deficit, and medical reform is urgently needed. In July 2000, the Korean government announced a separation of medicine and pharmacy. Doctors would only be responsible for treating patients and writing prescriptions, which patients could then take to any pharmacy to get their meds. This meant doctors would lose a significant amount of under-the-table income from pharmaceutical companies. A month later, doctors across the country went on strike, with 95% refusing to treat patients. However, the real driving force behind this reform was American pharmaceutical companies and the International Monetary Fund. In front of them, the Korean Medical Association is pretty powerful, but they still come in second. To make sure the reforms go smoothly, the Korean government decided to give doctors more perks. In a behind-closed-doors meeting, the government promised the doctors' representatives that they would cut medical school admissions by 10% over 4 years, keeping the annual intake at 3,058 students. Plus, the National Assembly also passed an amendment to the medical law. The rule that allowed the revocation of doctors' licenses for crimes has been abolished, which means that even if a doctor has been convicted of serious crimes like murder or rape, they can continue practicing medicine as soon as they're out of prison. In South Korea, the private hospitals controlled by multinational pharmaceutical companies and the monopolistic doctors' groups have become three powerful interest groups that are hard to challenge. In South Korea, you often see a similar situation where American capital and multinational companies are at the top, local conglomerates and vested interest groups are in the middle, and the general public is at the bottom. This structure isn't just a coincidence. In the age of economic globalization, a country's domestic order often reflects the international order. In July 2018, a set of nude photos of elderly women popped up on a South Korean online forum and quickly went viral, causing a huge stir in public opinion. The situation calmed down after a 40-year-old civil servant from Seoul was arrested for posting them, but the elderly women in the photos, known as the Boki grandmas, became more recognized in South Korean society. In Seoul's Jongmyo Park, grandmas aged 60 to 80 are slathering on thick foundation and bright red lipstick, selling their aging bodies to make ends meet. They wander around the park, pretending to pitch health drinks to men, but really, they're trading their bodies for food. Each transaction is just $8. In an interview, one of these grandmas told a reporter, "I don't need respect, I just want 3 meals a day." In South Korea, the poverty rate for women over 65 is a staggering 47.2%, and for single women, it's even higher at 76%. Over the past 25 years, the suicide rate among the elderly has doubled. However, looking at the economic indicators, the UN confirmed in July 2021 that South Korea is a developed country. But in everyday life, it's hard to believe that something like Grandma Baja's situation is the price of being developed. In fact, some indicators in developed countries, like South Korea, seem a bit off. For example, according to a Gallup survey, South Koreans have an average sleep time of about 6.5 hours, which is the shortest among all developed countries. In 2023, South Korea's total fertility rate dropped to a world record low of 0.72. This strange situation reflects the limits of what the current world order can allow for a new nation to emerge. Historically, the US-led world order is quite different from the British-led colonial system. In the colonial system, the colonies served mainly as sources of raw materials and markets for finished products, while most industrial production took place in Britain itself. At that time, the industrial capital on the production side was able to grab a bigger share of the profits and take charge of investment in industry upgrades, while the colonies on the resource and consumer sides were constantly being suppressed. In the world order led by the US, a lot of industrial production processes were moved overseas, with the US mainly focused on exporting capital and consumer finance. Financial capital dominated the investment in industrial production and the tech upgrade process. By squeezing the profits from production, countries like Saudi Arabia and Australia are cashing in by tying their commodities to the dollar and benefiting from the US system. Meanwhile, East Asia mainly handles the low-profit end of production in this world system set up by the US, and in major companies, American capital still holds a big chunk of the shares to take a cut of the profits. By squeezing profits from the production side, these companies avoid putting any extra capital into R&D for industrial upgrades. At the same time, to keep this system going,